All right, so there's probably been several times where something is fed back in these videos, and I'm going to address the common problem of feedback when mixing. I'm going to turn those lights on. Now, there are several okay, well, I'll start at basically, what happens when feedback is the microphone is picking up what's coming through the speaker, which is then producing what's coming through the microphone, which is then producing, which is then going to the speaker, and then the microphone is picking the speaker up, and the speaker is producing the microphone sound, and it's just a loop. And that is just, you call that, a feedback loop. And so basically, the more the microphone picks up what's coming out of the speaker, the more feedback you're going to have. And then so that's why you want to put the microphones behind the speakers if you can. So on stage, all the mics are behind the mains. So any feedback that you might get would be from the wedges, which happens quite a bit. But like this microphone I have out here, if I turn up the gain too much, check, hello, hello. If I turn it up too much, hello, hello. Did you hear that? That was feedback. So what happened there was this microphone was picking what was coming out of the speakers, and then that was coming through the speakers, and then it just kept looping. And so it caused it to feedback. So one thing you can do is just try to, in setting up, just try and move the microphones away from the speakers. The more distance there is between those, the better. And don't have something on stage directly behind a wedge. Only have, see how the two mics, that one and that one, that one and that one, see how they're like not right behind the wedge? That's good. And there's no mics out here that are, except this one that I was just using, that are behind the main speakers. That's what you want to do. Now what happens during feedback? Like how do you stop it? Well, the best thing to do is just turn down the fader. The best thing to do is just turn down the fader on the board. But a lot of times you won't really know where the feedback's coming from. So sometimes you'll just have to mute the channels. There's several really ways that you can stop it. If the feedback is from the mains, then you can just pull down the mains here. And that will turn down, this is essentially turning down all the faders. So that's a safe bet. But a problem that happens a lot is that the feedback is not from the main speakers, it's from these stage wedges. So if it's feeding back and then you cut the mains and it's still not working, then go turn down the stage wedge volumes. And then everything will get quiet and you're like, okay, now we can work on this. So then you can begin by turning it back up to a volume where things were back where they were, and then you probably could use the input or output meter to look, but I haven't done that really. So usually you'll just wait for it to happen again and then have everything, unmute all the channels, and then kind of wait for it to feed back again, and then just go through, and if you find the channel that's feeding back when it stops when you hit mute. So if it's still feeding back, feeding back, feeding back, feeding back, feeding back, okay, it stopped. Then it was the bass that was feeding back. But usually it's one of the guitars, Zach guitar, electric number 2, Zach vocals, secondary vocals, sometimes it's acoustic. It's very, very rarely any of the drums or bass, just because they're so far back and they're not near any of the wedges. So most of the time it's going to be somewhere in here for your feedback. So you could probably try channels 11 through 16 first. Now if it's feeding back in the house, you're going to have to either adjust where they're standing or just turn down their volume. There's really nothing else you can do. Well, you could adjust their EQ and find the frequency that's feeding back if you want. So you could come in here to your studio, and then see how there's a peak here. That's probably one of the frequencies that's feeding back. So you could pull it down if you want. Maybe that would stop it feeding back. Or you can also just turn their volume down. Now, if they're feeding back in the wedges, then you can just turn their level down in the wedge, and then that'll solve the problem. Because like sometimes the guitars will be turned up all the way in the wedge, and then they get right up next to it, and then they just start feeding back. So the less that comes out of the wedge, the better when it comes to that. So that can kind of help to minimize feedback. So that's what you do if something feeds back.